Okay, so in genetics, people are worried and wondering about how things are passed on from one generation to the next. Okay, and so here we're going to be looking at dihybrid crosses, so that means that we're looking at two different traits. Okay, so two different traits. So here we're going to give an example. So we're saying that dragons are going to have horns, and if you have horns, it means that you have at least one big H. Okay, so if you have one big H, that means that you have horns. And the only way that you do not have to have horns is if you have two little H's. Okay, so two little H's means that you have no horns. So that's the big H is dominant and the little h is recessive. And then we're going to look at a second trait because we're looking at two different traits. And so if you have a fancy dragon tail, that means you have at least one big T. But if you have just a normal plain tail, whatever that looks like, then you're going to have a little t. And so same thing, you can have a fancy tail and be big T, or you can have a fancy tail and be big T, little t. But the only way to have a plain tail is if you're little t. Does that make sense so far? So, the other word we have to remember is heterozygous. Hetero means different, so if you have one of each. So that means you would have like a big and a little. If you were homozygous, they would have to tell you if it was homozygous dominant, that meant big T, homozygous recessive, like little t. Okay? So, to set this up, to do two traits, we have a mom. We got to figure out what the mom and dad's genotypes are. And so for the mom, it says that she's heterozygous for horns. So that would mean that she's big H, little h. And she's heterozygous for a tail. So she's big T, little t. And then the dad has no horns and a plain tail. So the only way that he can have no horns is if he has two little h's. So he's little h. Sorry. And then the plain tail goes back up to here. Plain tail. The only way he can be plain-tailed is if he's little t. Okay, so that makes sense? Alright, so then the way I do it, I learned this in college, so it's way quicker and easier, is that even though we're looking at two traits, all we're going to do is two different Punnett squares. Instead of one big, huge 16 Punnett square, we just do two little ones. So we'll do Punnett squares. And we'll just do h's first, so that means you put a big H up here and a little h. That would be the mom. And then the dad's little h goes here. And then we just bring down the big H and the little h, combine, and then the little h comes down, and then this little h comes over. And big H, little. Okay? Now, in the question, it asked about the phenotype. And so when we look here, two of these offspring are going to have one big H, so that means that they show the dominant trait, so they have horns. So 2 out of the 4, or 1/2, we can do math and reduce, so 1/2 are going to have horns, and then these two guys are two little h's, so half of them are no horns. Okay, so then we'll do the Punnett square for the t's. So we're going to put the big T, little t up top, and then the dad's little t on the top, on the side. And then we fill stuff in. Do you see how we filled stuff in? So then the same thing, we're going to, looking at phenotypes. Again, phenotypes are how you physically look. If they had asked for genotype, then we would do the letters, like the big T, little t's. But they want phenotype. So it's the same thing. Half are going to contain the big T. And so that means fancy tail. We look up at the top. Fancy. And then half we're going to have just 2 little t's, so that's a plain tail. Now here's where we get to do math. Isn't that exciting? So half times a half, if we were adding a half plus a half, it would equal a whole. But we're multiplying, and so all we do is we multiply straight across. So 1 times 1 is 1, and then 2 times 2 is 4. So there's 1/4, but we have to combine. So here's what we're multiplying together, these guys. The words. So it's going to have horns, and it's going to be fancy. My marker would work. Okay. And then we'll cross together these guys. So now it's going to be a half times, oh boy, a half. So same answer, 1/4, but now it's going to be horns and plain tail. And then we have to put together these 2 options. So again, half times a half, again 1/4. But this time there's no horns and a fancy tail. And then our last possibility that could happen is that we have, half times a half equaling 1/4. No horns, and it's a plain tail. Okay, so these are all the different, it's a P. These are all the different possibilities that could happen if these 2 parents who are married got together and had kids. Okay? And because it's 2 traits, we need to make sure that we're listing 2 different options, like versus their horns and their tails. All right, you get it?
I wish one of the questions were to draw it, was to draw a dragon, just for fun.
I know. I suppose we could say your final thing is to draw the dragon, but we're not. Okay. Okay, so in summary, to figure out how to do dihybrid crosses, what you're going to have to remember is that you need to look at what the parents are. Okay, so figure out what their genotypes are for both traits. And then you're going to put together Punnett squares that deal with just one letter. So notice over here, like in this Punnett square, we have just the H's, and then for the second Punnett square, we have just the T's, and that's huge. You cannot, if you're going to do it this way, you cannot combine the 2 different letters. H's have to go with H's, T's have to go with T's. And then down here, I call these mini answers. Okay, so you'd figure out, like, just for the H's, what would this be? So it would be, if we were doing 1 Punnett square, what would be the answer for this 1 Punnett square? So that's like your mini answers for the H's and the T's. And then the most important part is then to multiply together all the different possibilities. So whatever your mini answers are, you multiply together all the different possibilities so that you can then put things together for a huge final answer. So we multiply together the 2 possibilities, And so whatever those possibilities are, sometimes it'll be 3/4 times 3/4, so it'll be 9/16. So whatever the answers are, you need to have a number and two different words, because we're looking at two different traits. That's why they call it dihybrid, because di means two. Okay, so I think this way is much easier and quicker because you do two Punnett squares, you figure out many answers, and then you let the math kind of tell you what the actual answers are, as opposed to looking at 16 boxes and figuring out, does it have horns or not horns, tail or no, fancy tail or plain tail, where here the math is just going to tell you the answer. So, yay math. All right, does that make sense? Do you get it?
Mm-hmm.